Good evening and welcome to the Sisco Memorial Forum, a discussion about preserving life, climate change, water, and diplomacy. I'm Barbara Stevenson, Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at UNC. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our partner, the American Academy of Diplomacy. AAD, as it's usually referred to, is an independent nonprofit association of more than 300 former senior U.S. ambassadors and high-level government officials. I'm proud to be a member of it. Tonight's event, and indeed our partnership with AAD, is part of UNC's new diplomacy initiative. One of my signature programs is Vice Provost for Global Affairs. After 34 years as an American diplomat, I can see how well positioned UNC is to be and to be seen as a top-tier university for producing the next generation of global leaders, including diplomats, foreign policy professionals, and national security experts. UNC is the only university in the entire American Southeast to host 5 national resource centers, area study centers recognized for their excellence in teaching about Asia, the Americas, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. We have hundreds of students in the peace, war, and defense curriculum, and hundreds more in the global curriculum. And while our students who are first-rate have access to a first-rate education here at Carolina, they tell me that they see themselves at a disadvantage to students in the DC area who have such ready access to the world of diplomacy, foreign policy, and national security. So my goal through the Diplomacy Initiative is to fill that gap and level that playing field by bringing some of the best foreign policy practitioners from Washington, DC, and elsewhere right here to Chapel Hill. And tonight's event does just that. Our premise for tonight's event is this, and here's a quote. Massive transnational problems need international cooperation to solve, and diplomacy is the link between US policy and effective action by states. We hope that at the conclusion of tonight's event, you will have a better idea of the vital role that diplomacy plays in preserving life by making possible international cooperation to protect the fragile planet we all call home. That quote I gave you about massive transnational problems and diplomacy, well, that comes from Ambassador Ron Newman, president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is the sponsor for tonight's event. I am grateful to Ron, my friend and colleague, for collaborating with me once again. A former US ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan, Ambassador Newman began his service to the United States as an Army infantry officer in Vietnam, and he joined the US Department of State as a Foreign Service officer in 1970. He spent much of his diplomatic career serving in the Middle East and North Africa. And most recently with the Academy, he continues his service by working to ensure that the American people understand what diplomats do and why it matters. Thank you, Ambassador Newman, for collaborating with Carolina, for bringing the Sisco Forum to the Mandela Auditorium, and for assembling this great panel. Please come up.
You know, moments like that, you used to shake hands with the person introducing you, but you can't do that anymore. Well, Barbara, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you to Ambassador Stevenson, Barbara, for this great collaboration. I want to thank also Carol Sisco, who is a member of the Academy as well, and who has helped endow this program and challenged other members of the Academy to match her funding, which created the basis for us to have this Sisco Forum once a year, named after the late Undersecretary of State, Joseph R. Sisco. And so that's now a permanent program of the American Academy of Diplomacy. The Academy is a small organization. Deliberately, we're selective about members, hopefully not snobbish. We like to think of ourselves as elite, but not elitist. A difference between qualifications and attitude, I hope. And it has two primary missions. One is to talk to the State Department about how to make diplomacy better. And we're very opinionated about that. And it's not just talking to the department, we talk to the Congress, and we actually work with the Congress to try to move things. So we don't just write reports, we work to have them implemented. But the other big effort of the Academy is to talk to Americans about diplomacy, about what diplomacy is and why diplomacy is important. And most people will acknowledge diplomacy is important. And having said that, for most people, they will have then exhausted their knowledge of the subject. And so we try to bring them a little further. And tonight is I think, a wonderful example, because there are now so many transnational problems, climate, environment, which we're talking about tonight, but pandemics, obviously we've been experiencing those, cyber problems, crime, and these problems all need transnational solutions. There's a little problem. There are no transnational institutions with independent authorities that do not come from states. You can't get there without states. That's too bad, because states don't always agree. But the fact is, you cannot create workable, enduring transnational solutions to transnational problems without bringing in states. And that's where diplomacy comes in, because diplomacy is not just about talking. Diplomacy, American diplomacy, is ultimately how you get foreigners to do what we think they should do and like it. The like it portion is important because you have to come back to them again and talk to them about something else. And so diplomacy becomes the critical link between policy ideas, which are like where you're going on your road trip, and strategy, which is how you get there, and diplomacy, which is how you drive the car. Diplomacy is about how you manage the strategy, how you manage the tactics in order to achieve the goal. And without that, however noble the program is, and however needful, you can't do it, or you're unlikely to do it. So we have a great program tonight to get into this in a lot of detail. It is my real pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Catherine Novelli. Now, I first met Kathy when she was the special representative, assistant U.S. trade representative. I have to read this because otherwise I can't get it all straight, for Europe and the Mediterranean, and that included Europe, Russia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa, a fairly wide definition. And I met her because I was going out to be ambassador in Bahrain, and I thought it would be a nifty, neat idea if we had a free trade agreement. And fortunately, Kathy thought so too. The trouble was that was not U.S. government policy. And so the two of us, mostly her, I think, designed a strategy that was the most complicated bureaucratic, I think, maneuver I've ever worked on, because it took 2 years to bring the U.S. government to begin these negotiations. But it was great. So that was where I first knew her. But she has all kinds of background, and before that, she has been taught. She's been a teacher. She's been the vice president of Apple for Worldwide Government Affairs. She was undersecretary of State Department for policy. And so this is an area that she has lived on both sides of the divide. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Catherine Novelli to give the keynote speech. Catherine, you're up.
Well, thanks, Ron, and thanks, Barbara. And it is really an honor to be here with such distinguished colleagues, people with amazing experience that you're going to hear from after you hear from me. And so what I thought we could start off with is just my question to you. We're here supposed to be talking about preserving life and environment, water, air. How many people here, show of hands, think that climate change is a challenge that we have to meet? That's an immediate problem. All right. So if you're a diplomat, that's called consensus. So I see almost every hand up here. And that's a first step really in solving problems, is getting that kind of a consensus. And, we know that climate change, the sixth mass extinction of the species since the beginning of the planet, stress on the ocean due to pollution, overfishing, and climate are posing an existential threat to our existence. And we also know that these issues don't just stop at a border. It's not like magic. So this is where diplomats come in. And I would say, before I go on, because I want to give you a couple of examples of how diplomacy has actually solved some problems and moved things forward. I teach at Georgetown, and one of the things that my students often say is they feel very discouraged. They feel very overwhelmed because it's so heavy, everything that's going on with the environment. It seems like every day there's a new problem. And I want to say to you, do not lose heart and do not lose hope. People are solving problems everywhere. Diplomats are, technology is, people your age are, entrepreneurs are, big companies, little companies. Solutions are emerging. What we really need, and where diplomacy can play a huge role, is political will. And that is, I'm going to tell you two stories about political will, because that's what can move things at a massive level. That is not to say that the only thing that matters is if things are moving at a massive level. And I think one of the things that we really have to guard against is complacency, saying somebody else is going to take care of this, so I don't have to worry about it. Everybody has to worry about it. And everybody has to worry about it at every level, because it all matters. And that consensus is how we're going to move forward on these incredibly difficult issues. So diplomacy. So many people think that diplomacy is government officials sitting on couches sipping tea or standing for photographs in front of flags. And I would tell you that certainly there is that kind of diplomacy and there's that kind of thing, but the diplomacy that we are going to need to deploy to meet these challenges is something that requires us all to be diplomats. And here's two examples of how we use diplomacy, but we didn't just talk to other diplomats or ourselves. So the first one is about the ocean. When I became undersecretary, I was asked to put on a conference on the ocean. And at least when I took on this, I was not a water expert like one of our speakers, Aaron, is going to be telling you about. So I didn't realize that the ocean covers 70% of our planet, produces half of the world's oxygen, and absorbs 50% more carbon than the atmosphere. I didn't realize all of that. And when I started to learn more, I also realized that having a conference where people just wrung their hands about all the big problems that we have and said, woe is me, and environment ministers talk to other environment ministers wasn't really going to move the needle. And Ron told you that before I became undersecretary. I worked at Apple. What he didn't tell you is that I worked for Steve Jobs at Apple, and he hired me to work there. And I learned from one of the best teachers about how to motivate people and how to move things forward in a way that is outside the box. So we decided we were going to do an outside the box conference, which wasn't super popular with people that were used to doing things in a certain way. But one of the things that our team recognized is that we had to have stakeholders that weren't just in their box of environment. We needed a bigger box. We needed to have government officials for sure, because they can make those big decisions. But if they just stayed in that environment box, we were never going to get anywhere, because nobody was really kind of listening to them on the big scale. So we got heads of state, and we got foreign ministers, and we got President Obama to come and speak. And we also had to think about how we empowered and invested not just Americans. We didn't want to just be telling everybody what they should think and have them like it. We wanted people to tell us about how they were solving problems. And there are people all over the world doing this. And this is where our embassies were super helpful, because our embassies, we told them, go out, find the most dynamic, problem-solving people that you can find who can communicate to all of us what they're doing. So we all understand that it's possible to solve these problems. And we can emerge from this with the vision about what we need to do and being inspired that it can get done. And we also understood that just talking really isn't going to do it. And I feel bad that I don't have pictures here, but what we did is we terraformed our conference room into an aquarium, into the ocean. And we partnered with National Geographic, and they brought all of this stuff, and you literally felt like you were a scuba diver in the ocean while you were listening to all of this. And all of our speakers were visual, and it was an experiential diplomacy that I don't think really anyone had quite done before. And we also had tangible evidence of problem solving. So we had a whole room full of things that people were doing, making furniture out of plastic that was recycled from the ocean, giant windmills that could power parts of Scotland, just all kinds of very tangible things that were being done and could be done. And at the end of it, we actually inspired an awful lot of people. I had ministers coming up to me thanking me for letting them come to this conference, which people who do diplomacy will tell you is almost unheard of. Like, it's just, if you're a diplomat, it's like, I have to go do this thing. And we had amazing results too. We created a brand called Our Ocean. We had logos, we had social media, we did all the things you're supposed to do, all the things I learned from Steve Jobs at Apple. And we raised, just in the one conference, $11 billion for ocean conservation with the B. And we also got countries to pledge that they would protect their waters, their pristine waters, off their coast that they controlled. And if you added that all together, that was the size of the continent of Europe. And the amount of marine protected areas, as they're called, went from this to this in one conference. But what was even more important about this is that we didn't want it to stop with one thing. We wanted to create a movement. And so because we succeeded, nothing succeeds like success, as they say. Because we succeeded, everybody else wanted to host this thing. And they're like, can we do it? Can we do it? So we had Chile, we had the European Union, we had Norway, we had Indonesia, all signed up year after year after year to host this. On into the next administration, this went on. It didn't matter who was at the State Department, it just kept on going on. And it is going on still. And this coming year, they had to postpone because of COVID, but in 2022, Palau and the United States are jointly sponsoring the next one of these. And the template that we set out, which was problem solvers, pledges, and actual solving of real problems and moving things forward, and that this needs to be quantum leaps each time, not just incremental leaps. That's gonna live on. And so that's an example of diplomacy. It could not have happened without diplomacy. It could not have happened without the leadership of the United States and our diplomats all rowing the boat in the same direction. The other example I want to give you is one that you probably do know about, which is the Paris Convention. the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, which I was also very privileged to be able to participate in. And again, Paris could not have succeeded unless many, many people's interests were vested in that result. Because if people don't believe what they're pledging to do, they're not going to do it. They may sign that piece of paper, but nothing will happen really. You just have an empty piece of paper. And so, you know, Paris was taking on the tragedy of the commons, which if you take economics, you've probably heard about, which means that there's this space that we're all using, but nobody really owns it. And so nobody takes responsibility for it. And that was what was really confronting us and had bedeviled us for a long time on climate. And the fact that things that are generating the climate issues are directly linked to economic growth. And so countries didn't want to do things that might cost more, especially in the developing world, but not just. And change is a hard thing. And so it matters if there's consensus. It matters not just if diplomats think there's consensus, but if your public thinks there's consensus, because that gives you political space to operate. And so one of the things that was super important about Paris was to get all the countries to agree at the highest level that action had to be taken. And that, again, was a feat of diplomacy. That was every embassy. That was every hand on deck. That was the Secretary of State. That was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. That was President Obama personally. That was John Podesta, the Chief of Staff. That was every hand, every time working on this. And they had allies. They didn't just work by themselves. It wasn't just the United States. It was our allies in Europe. And most importantly, it was our alliance with China. And right now we're in a place where, you know, everything China does is people look askance. I'm just saying we would never have Paris without China. And it was where we realized that we both had the same interest in protecting the environment and working on climate. And once the Chinese were willing to sign on that there needed to be a result in Paris, they went to work using their diplomacy in their region to push other countries also to take these hard decisions and do these hard things. And so when we met in Paris, we knew that we needed to get an agreement on reduction of carbon. What had happened in the past is that folks wanted to use formulas to do this. Everybody has to cut by X%. And that just wasn't going to work because countries weren't willing to take that on. So I think the brilliance of Paris was to say, okay, we're going to have these individually determined contributions, IDCs, and countries would decide for themselves what they were going to do. How much reduction were they going to take? And they could figure out for themselves how they were going to get there. So they didn't have anybody saying you will do it this way or you will do it that way. We knew at the end of the day, we did not meet the goal of having enough reduction to keep the climate from rising less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we could see that we weren't going to get there. So we built in a 5-year review, which is going to be taking place in Glasgow in November, to try to say, okay, we're going to turn the screw farther the next time. And we're going to spend the time between this agreement and that one and those meetings and work on how we're going to push reduction even farther. And the other piece of this was a recognition that this wasn't just about politics or words. It was also about how we could empower the economies, especially in the developing world, to be able to take risks. And part of that was pledging funding from governments, funding from investment banks, funding from philanthropists to fund some innovative work on green technology. And so all of that piece is what made up Paris. I would tell you, we had a setback for 4 years when the United States pulled out of Paris. It meant that our ability to influence what was going to be happening at this next agreement was definitely hampered. And the normal diplomats who would be working on this were not supposed to be working on it. So it was hampered, there's no doubt. But lots of other countries were continuing to work ahead. And hopefully in Glasgow, we will make some progress. One of the other things I would say is that it isn't just about focusing on climate agreements. That's not where we are now. Now we're in a place where we have to think about what are all the tools we can use to try to move ahead. And one of the things that we started way back when, before the free trade agreement with Bahrain, but we incorporated in that agreement, was when we negotiated the free trade agreement with Jordan, which was in 1999, I think. We negotiated the first agreement that had environment in the text of a trade agreement. That had never happened before. And we wanted to leverage the fact that we were doing a free trade agreement with, we would like to have these environmental commitments. And we were able to achieve it. But what was really interesting about that was Jordan was very environmental minded anyway, but they were really concerned. How were they going to live up to something at a high level? What if they couldn't do it? And they didn't want to promise something that they couldn't actually fulfill. So we innovated something else, and that was taking our AID package and using that and building it around those commitments that Jordan made where they felt like they needed help, particularly in how to build an environmental protection administration, how to have the public participate more in policymaking. And so that was the first time we actually had aid administrators sitting at the negotiating table with us, figuring out not only how could we get where we want to go, our objective, how can we help Jordan get where they want to go, and that it could be a total win-win. So I think that thinking about those kind of tools outside the box is where we need to go for the future. And we know we have so much more to do. So a few thoughts about that, and then I would really welcome your questions. First, think about how much money is being spent by international development banks on infrastructure worldwide in the developing world. It's $1 trillion a year. That's a lot. And right now, there is not a consistent systemic look at how do we make sure that what our priority is in spending money on infrastructure are things that are going to help with the problem of climate and environment. That just isn't the priority. And it needs to be the priority. And the other piece of this is how do we build those things in a green way? And just turning that piece could have a huge impact. The other piece is thinking about how we can use trade tools as an incentive, maybe a bit of a stick, maybe a bit of a carrot, for countries who are either not living up to their Paris commitments or should be doing more. And the Europeans are way ahead of us on this. They just adopted the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. And their idea is that they're going to put a carbon price on imports for targeted products. And if you're making something and you're sending it there and you're making it in a very unclean way, the cost of your product once it comes into Europe is going to be higher. And you are going to have to actually buy credits, so that carbon credits, so that you can bring down the carbon price of your product. That's one way of thinking about it. There's lots of other ways, but these are the kinds of things that we need everybody's brain to be working on. And it's not just about that. It's also about how do we catalyze more investment in the private sector? How do we ensure capital development of entrepreneurs, especially in developing countries? They're creating incredible solutions. I was so lucky to travel the world as undersecretary, and everywhere I went, I always met with entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, and practically everybody was working on something related to climate. Amazing things. And I just saw, for example, I met these young entrepreneurs who are figuring out how to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it down, deep down into the earth and sort of encase it in rock. Iceland just now launched that. And so, I mean, there is a lot going on. And what I want to say in conclusion is that diplomats, all of us who are going to be talking to you, we're not the only diplomats. You all are diplomats too. And we need you to be diplomats. We need you to do outreach, to convince people, to think creatively, to do what's needed to meet this challenge, because we can't do it without you. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'd love to take your questions.
Kathy gets to be the good person. She answers the questions. I get to be the bad one. I pick the ones that some won't get answered. But we have about 10 minutes. So who has got a question? We stunned you into silence. Yes.
So your conversation on Jordan, I was wondering, like Jordan is developing, they have, since they care about climate, a little about India wants a critical people, so they get control. So where's the balance of like, some need to pay for climate change, but it also needs to be the entire world because it's a transnational issue, but also the West is being contributing to climate change. How do we strike the balance in that?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful question. And India in particular, you know, one of the goals there is there's a lot of people who don't have any electricity. So the question is, how do you get people electricity quickly? And the conventional wisdom is, oh, well, you have to use coal. But in fact, we have come so far, particularly on wind, that you do not have to use coal, and particularly on microgrids, that you don't have to use coal. And you can do a ton of things in communities. We've shown it in Africa, where you don't even need to be connected to a grid. And so I think part of this is really trying to encourage out of the box thinking. Part of the reason why there was this $1 billion fund that was put up in Paris was to try to help the concerns of countries like India, who say, well, it's going to cost us a lot of money and we're developing and we need some assistance here. So that's part of what that fund is supposed to be for. And I agree, we have to balance these things. I guess I'm not super sympathetic to the argument that, well, you know, when you were developing, you polluted, so we should be able to now. We're not in a situation where we have that luxury anymore. And to me, the question is, how do we go forward solving this problem and getting you, the country in question, to where you want to be for your people and your own economic development? And the sort of blaming game of other people, that's just deflecting what really needs to be done, in my personal opinion.
I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask you a question myself and take you back to some real personal diplomacy and ask you to talk about how you managed to, in a way, save the Ross Sea in the Arctic.
Oh, thank you for asking me that one. That's one of my favorite projects. So there is a sea in Antarctica, the Ross Sea. It's a huge piece of the ocean, and it is completely pristine. I mean, we are able to do all kinds of science there because we can see all the layers of how biodiversity works in that place. It's untouched. And people at the State Department have been working for 10 years to try to get a consensus on protecting the Ross Sea without success. And so when I came in, people always ask you, well, what is one of your goals? And that was one of mine. And I was determined that I was not going to leave my position without getting this done. And everyone told me it was impossible. So what we needed to get done were two things. We had most everybody, but we didn't have Russia or China, kind of important countries. And we couldn't get Russia because Russia had invaded Crimea and we weren't allowed to talk to them. And we couldn't get China because the Chinese just wouldn't engage with us. So to get China, I had developed a friendship with China's climate negotiator, who is currently still their climate negotiator, because we bonded over the fact that we both had done environmental law early in our career. And what's not known so much about him is that he was kind of put in a closet by the Chinese government at the time because environment wasn't anything that was popular and because he was really true to his principles. And they kind of took him out of the closet, took him out of mothballs when they decided they wanted to do something about climate. And so I asked my staff to come and to have him come, because I said I want to meet with him to talk about the Ross Sea. And they said, he has nothing to do with the Ross Sea. Why are you doing this? And I'm just like, just do it. So he came to my couch in my office and I just said, look, you have put your career on the line for the environment. I know you care about it. And I know you know that this is the most pristine place on earth and we have to do something. This is our last chance. We've got to get it done. You have to help me. And he looked at me, he thought about it and he goes, okay, one of my best friends is the person in charge of this. I will help you. And it got done. So that was China. And then we had to do Russia and we couldn't talk to Russia. So I sat down and I asked my team, who does President Putin listen to? Who can we get to talk to him? And so we had various people, we had National Geographic, we had all these people. And then it became very clear that Prince Albert of Monaco was actually really good friends with President Putin. They worked on the Olympics together. And I happened, because Prince Albert is a huge proponent of the ocean, I had met Prince Albert doing our oceans. So I called him up and I said, we need you to help us. You have to convince him. And no one, he won't listen to anyone else. We can't talk to him. You have to do it. And he did it. And we got the Ross Sea protected. So I guess the moral of this story is that diplomacy is also about personal relationships. And it's also about asking people to do the right thing and trusting that everyone isn't cynical. People will do the right thing when given the opportunity.
Who's got another one? Oh, Maria, you got one there from the online.
Yes, we've got a number of questions. Let me go ahead to start at the top. Kevin Fogg asked a question that is pivoting a little bit from economics to security. You have connected environmental issues very cleanly to economic ones, but not to security. Individual countries have understood environmental concerns to their security, but has there also been diplomatic use of security relationships to push environmental reform?
Yes. And in fact, one of the things that we've done on illegal fishing in the ocean, which is a huge problem because it depletes fish stocks, is to work actually with the Navy. And the Navy has been an incredible ally on this because they understand that the same people that are doing illegal fishing are doing all kinds of other illegal things. And so they don't want that obviously going on. So they work through their channels to actually try to get their counterparts in other countries to take this on in their countries as well. So yes, there has been actual work on that. And of course, I think everyone understands that having huge parts of continents underwater because of sea rise is going to cause all kinds of national security issues. And lots of people are worried about that, which is why there is a full court press now to deal with climate.
Do we have another one in the audience? Oh, right here. Okay,
Uh,
please, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just had a question. You mentioned about European Union using carbon credit as a mechanism to deal with climate change. But my question is that one of the ways that carbon credit is done is hydropower, because hydropower is seen as renewable. So you can do the carbon trading and get the waste. But if you think of in terms of what hydropower does to a large population of people, how, as a diplomat, how do you see that being balancing out? And like Three Gorges is one of the examples of what hydropower can do, but it is also something that is always used as a way of doing a lot of carbon trading. And that's what European Union is investing a lot in India, in some parts of India. So how, as a diplomat, do you see that?
No, and you know what, that is, I think hydropower is one of the most difficult things because of exactly what you say. And, you know, you think about displacement, you think about Aswan in Egypt. I mean, hydropower isn't benign. You know, I think people would feel that solar power and wind power is mostly benign, except for the poor birds who get caught in the wind turbines. But I think hydropower is a much more complicated thing. So I'm not here to say that the EU system is perfect. It obviously is not, but they're the only ones who are trying to do anything right now. And I think part of what has to evolve is looking at these kind of questions and how much do we really want to support hydropower over other types of renewable energy.
We've got time for one more question, and can we have one from, well, we're due for one from the line though, so
Okay, sorry.
we've been trying to, you want to go up there? Okay, then, sorry about that for the online audience.
I'll try to talk faster.
Okay. So we all met here today because we agree that there is a problem, and science shows us this. But what's a feasible framework or foundational policy you would recommend here in the US to work towards a climate solution, whether it be empowering women with education to improve the society aspect because environment is interconnected with societal issues, or would you go more the economic route in incentivizing innovation through green technology?
If I could do one thing only, but which I will tell you, I think that's facile because you really need to do multiple things. If I could only do one, I would put a price on carbon. I would put a tax on carbon. I would put it at a high enough level. And the reason why is coming from inside a company, price absolutely matters. And what you would see is a huge drive towards efficiency of use, you know, of energy in the products that were built and in the making of those products. And you would also see incredible innovation on renewables. And I think nothing would incentivize that faster than making it costly. I mean, that,
Would you
know,
repeat the question?
she wanted to know what it would take to get that passed. That is a really hard thing, but it has been a proposal that's out there. Bipartisan support among those who are not elected politicians at this moment, including Jim Baker. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there has been bipartisan support on this. I think economists recognize that that has to be done. That is not the only thing. You're absolutely right. There needs to be more education. There needs to be more everything. And in the absence of a price on carbon, all those everythings become really important.
And I know this audience could keep you going, but we do have a hard line, and we do have some other folk we have to talk about also. And I really hate to cut it off because you're always fascinating on this stuff. So Kathy, thank you for coming. Barbara, you're up.
Thank you, Ambassador Novelli and Ambassador Newman. I admit I have been a girl fan of the Our Ocean Conference for so many years. I think it is absolutely the way that diplomacy in the future, it's what it will look like. It's how we're going to solve these transnational challenges. And the idea to get to sit here tonight with Ambassador Novelli, who told me privately she took a few bullets on the way of convincing Mother State, as all of us would call the State Department, that we could do this a different way. We could bring in different stakeholders and we could approach it a different way. So, you know, congratulations to you. It's a really huge achievement. That was wonderful. To continue our exploration of tonight's topic, which is the role of diplomacy in delivering the international cooperation that's needed to protect the environment and preserve life, it's now my honor to invite our panelists to come up and join me. So I'll ask each of our panelists to give opening remarks of about 5 minutes each, and then we'll turn to Q&A. And during that Q&A session, I'll begin with a few prepared questions that have been submitted in advance from the PWAD 250 class, among others. And then I'll move to live questions, just like you've seen us do from live stream and the audience that's here. I'm going to invite each panelist to make his way up as I read his bio, starting with Ambassador Ken Brill. Former Ambassador Ken Brill was the president of the Fund for Peace from 2010 to 2011. He completed a 35-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service in 2010. In his final Foreign Service assignment, he was the founding director of the U.S. National Counterproliferation Center, part of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Ambassador Brill served as NCPC's director for 5 years. Brill's overseas assignments with the State Department include serving as ambassador to the IAEA and the UN office in Vienna, ambassador to Cyprus, acting ambassador and deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, and political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan. His domestic assignments in the Department of State included serving as acting assistant secretary and principal deputy assistant secretary of state for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Science Affairs. Welcome, Ken. He was also kind of my boss at one point, one of my all-time favorites. Brian Atwood. J. Brian Atwood is the Senior Fellow for International Studies and Public Affairs at the Thomas Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. He served for 6 years as administrator of the Agency for International Development, so the very head of USAID. And that was during the Clinton administration. He led the transition team of the State Department and was Undersecretary of State for Management prior to his appointment as head of USAID. In 2001, Atwood served on UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's panel on peace operations. He joined the Foreign Service in 1966 and served in the American embassies in Cote d'Ivoire and Spain. During the Carter administration, Atwood served as Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations. He was the first president of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs from 1986 to 1993. Atwood received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award in 1999. Welcome, Brian. And Aaron Salzberg. Aaron Salzberg is the director of the Water Institute and the Don and Jennifer Holzworth Distinguished Professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering within the Gillings School of Global Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill, the nation's #1 public school of global public health. Before joining UNC Chapel Hill, Salzberg managed the development and implementation of U.S. foreign policy on drinking water and sanitation, water resources management, and transboundary water at the U.S. Department of State. From 2010 to 17, Salzberg served as the State Department's first special coordinator for water resources. Salzberg currently holds an appointment as a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and serves as a member of the World Meteorological Organization Scientific Research Board. He is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions, including the Frank E. Lloyd Award for Environmental Diplomacy from the U.S. Department of State. Yes, the State Department gives awards for excellence in environmental diplomacy. I would now like to invite each of our panelists to share a few opening remarks on tonight's topic. Ambassador Brill, can you please begin by setting the stage and describing the State Department's role in environmental and climate diplomacy?
Thanks so much, Barbara. I'll say it again when I get a microphone. Thank you very much, Barbara, and thanks to the University of North Carolina and AAD for organizing tonight's event. And it's great to be sitting on a panel with two very distinguished former colleagues. Diplomacy for centuries dealt with issues that we would now consider environmental, such as fishery agreements, which the early American government struck with the British very early in our history. But the growing awareness of the impact of environmental issues globally and the need to address them globally led in the 1970s to environmental diplomacy becoming a significant issue for international diplomacy and indeed becoming its own brand, as they might say, in the private sector. The UN's 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment focused attention on the need for multilateral diplomacy to develop global responses to environmental challenges and even created a new UN organization to support the effort. In 1973, the US Congress created the State Department's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. And then in 1978, the Congress again directed the Secretary of State, and through him, the OES, to be in charge of US government activities involved with foreign governments and international organizations on that range of issues, such as oceans, environment, and other topics that are dealt with by OES. Started in 1973, OAS's staff today is respected in foreign ministries and technical ministries around the world. It has a mix of environment science and health policy expertise. It also has more civil servants than foreign service officers, which is an interesting thing we might talk about later. OAS engages in over 70 bilateral and multilateral negotiations involving its agenda, principally environmental issues, each year. Imagine that, 70, over 70. Environmental diplomacy has steadily become more important, but climate change, with its cascading consequences, is the first such environmental issue to really become an urgent, top-tier US national security issue. Now, for issues like that, the president and his cabinet and the special climate emissary, former Secretary Kerry, will set the policy for those kinds of issues. For more mundane international environmental issues, more senior officials in the interagency with some White House oversight will be the ones making the policy. The State Department, through OAS, typically coordinates and integrates the interagency process, because there are many stakeholders in these things, as Ambassador Novelli mentioned, integrates the effort by the interagency to get what's important in the issues for the United States, and then come up with options, policy options for the president or for other senior officials to decide what US policy is going to be. And then the State Department through OAS will do the follow-on work that puts the flesh on the bones of these policy decisions and turns them into operational details and diplomatic negotiating and engagement strategies. The State Department through OAS and others will also coordinate an outreach to non-US government stakeholders on these issues. And that can range from the business community to the full range of NGOs and a number of different kinds of groups in between to find out what do they think about these issues generally. But as you come up to a big negotiation, what do they specifically think about the issues at that negotiation? And I can assure you that those kinds of consultations are going on now in preparation for the meetings in Glasgow. Once policy has been set, diplomatic engagement becomes more active, both multilaterally and bilaterally. Now, multilateral environmental diplomacy, to my way of thinking, is important because its goal is to establish the rules of the road. That is to develop among countries a common understanding of the problem, work out agreed actions to deal with it, develop timetables where possible for performance, and always to find ways to help nations that need help in meeting any obligations or commitments they might make. The Montreal Protocol for the Protection of the Ozone Layer is a model environmental treaty. It's a treaty that has established and consistently over the 20 or 30 years strengthened legally binding obligations, timetables for meeting those obligations, as well as support mechanisms to help states that need help in phasing out ozone depleting substances. Climate agreements in contrast, I have to say, are essentially hortatory at this point. Commitments are voluntary. A lot of the work that was done in Paris was novel. The commitments were still voluntary. We haven't yet gotten to a legally binding approach to climate. We clearly need to do more. Glasgow and beyond have got to be moving more in that direction of people making legally binding commitments, I believe. Now, multilateral diplomacy gets the headlines. We've all heard about COP26 coming up in Glasgow, for example. But bilateral diplomacy is integral to environmental diplomacy. And again, State Department has a big role in this. Before any multilateral negotiation, OAS will send out to embassies around the world points to use with their governments to try to get them to see things our way, to learn what those governments are thinking, and to try to find ways of getting common ground. And also during negotiations, OAS will lead the way to reaching out to embassies to help us deal with governments that are being difficult in negotiations, that aren't moving in the way that are necessary for the negotiations to conclude successfully. Environmental issues can also be important, be an important aspect of a bilateral relationship or a regional relationship for the United States because of country-specific or region-specific issues. And water is a good example of this. And again, Aaron Salzberg has had a lot of work in Washington and in the field and being successful in helping people deal with water when it's an issue in the bilateral or regional relationship. USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, often plays a key role in dealing with country and region-specific environmental issues, as former Director Atwood will mention. And then finally, as Ambassador Novelli mentioned, environmental diplomacy can become a bilateral issue through a free trade agreement. And I think there are now 13 free trade agreements that have environmental chapters. The State Department, OAS in particular, but other parts of the State Department, other agencies within the US government will be working with the host government officials and others to try to make sure that those environmental chapters are lived up to as they were agreed initially. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of this or answer any of your questions during the question period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. And I'd now like to ask Brian Atwood for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. It is an honor to be on this panel with these two distinguished gentlemen and to be here at the University of North Carolina. Had an unexpected pleasure to have a reunion with my godson, who's sitting up in the audience here, Dr. William Fisher, who is just returned from Africa, where he has spent a lot of time working on various viruses. And I just wanted to recognize him because of the wonderful work that he does, and the university ought to be very proud of him. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, was the first to explicitly recognize as part of its national security strategy that there were 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And I guess I'm here to represent the 3rd D, although most of my career actually has been practicing and teaching the 2nd D, diplomacy. And I like to think about my tenure, 6.5 years at USAID. The things I'm most proud of are what I call development diplomacy, convincing others to go along with the approach that we were taking on various issues. And one of those, of course, is water. The development work is divided into sectors, and we have technical experts in all of these sectors. They could be democracy and governance. It could be economic growth. It could be agriculture. It could be, of course, the environment. And in each of these cases, water is directly related, even education, which is another one of the sectors. It is obviously an important element. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't get very far in life if you don't have access to water and food. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci once said, "Water is the driving force of all nature." And development policy on water is both global and local. And we seek global consensus, as Ken Brill was saying, and as Kathy was mentioning earlier in her wonderful remarks. We seek global consensus on an approach, a general approach to these issues. But we also, after reaching that consensus, we have to act locally. And that's where development work comes into play. It's an era of climate shocks. I don't have to remind you today, we went through a deluge of rain and yesterday as well. And it seems that every time that happens, it gets more intense. So there's no one that has to remind you as to what the effects of climate change are. But we talk about the word you'll hear over and over again is resilience. In fact, there's now at USAID a Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, which plays a very big role with OES in this intergovernmental, interagency effort. When you think about resilience in terms of climate science, you hear the word mitigation. And when you talk about water, you talk about managing the resource, you talk about regulating the resource, you talk about working with governments in a whole variety of ways. And you also have to think about how you finance the infrastructure that Catherine Novelli was talking about that is needed in today's world. I'll never forget when I chaired, one of the things that Barbara did not mention was the fact that I chaired for 2 years the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And while there, I was visited by a very distinguished French gentleman by the name of Michel Camdessou. Some of you may remember that he was the Director General of the International Monetary Fund. What he came to see me about was surprising, because he'd spent most of his career after the IMF working on water-related issues. And he wanted to talk to me about a global effort that he had underway, which was to discuss how we could finance the efforts that were needed to assure water quality, to assure that we could control water in any variety of ways. I want to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations that relates to this, relates to water. It is SDG, as we call it, 6. The global goal says, ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. I want to talk to you a little bit about how diplomacy created that SDG and the role that I played in it. As you may recall, the Sustainable Development Goals were preceded by the Millennium Development Goals. When I became administrator of USAID, if you were to ask any number of people what AID did, you would get that number of answers. And it was frustrating for me, so I put the agency through a strategic planning process wherein we came up with 5 goals, strategic goals. What I learned in that process was that Congress didn't care much about the UN's commitment to 0.7% of your GDP being spent because the US never had endorsed it, and it would have been an exponential increase in my budget. So I figured the better way to approach this was to actually let them know what strategic goals the agency had. I took that effort to the Development Assistance Committee, where I would attend once a year as part of the high-level ministerial meeting. And I began to get frustrated because all they wanted to talk about was volume, and 0.7% in some of the Scandinavian countries had it actually reached that goal, and I had to commend them for it. But their economies were so much smaller than my countries. And I finally convinced them that they ought to be talking about strategic goals. And they went through an exercise. Fortunately, a fellow by the name of Jan Pronk, who was the senior minister from the Netherlands, grabbed a hold of this, and he and I pushed this forward. And it took us 2 years to negotiate what became the Millennium Development Goals. They were later endorsed by the United Nations at the change of the millennium in 2000. Why was that important? Why was that important in building a consensus as to what it was we wanted to achieve? Before that, each donor defined their own goals, each donor and each partner. They mostly focused, again, as I said, on volume. But now we not only have goals, we also have measurement devices so that we can see whether or not we're actually achieving those goals. So I look back on my career as the head of AID, and there were a lot of things I was pleased about, including saving the agency from being merged into the State Department. I must say, I say that as a person who was Undersecretary for Management, Assistant Secretary of State, and I love the State Department. But I didn't think that the time frame that you look at development projects, which is 10 to 15 years, and the time frame that a Foreign Service officer does diplomacy is very short, comparatively speaking. So thanks to SDG in part, the US government, the Congress of the United States, and this is always good to remind people that on occasion they do something on a bipartisan basis, passed the Water for the World Act back in 2014. And you referenced that, Ken, to some extent. That involves some 15 different agencies, but it's primarily the administrator of AID and the Secretary of State who designate people to co-chair that interagency group. And it so happens it's the head of the Bureau for Resilience in the USAID and the head of the OES Bureau at the State Department. So we're kind of sitting here metaphorically, representing those bureaus. At the global level, and this is important as well, there are some 80 governments, civil society, academia, and the private sector that get together under, and again, to support SDG 6, under the Sanitation and Water for All Partnership. Again, people are collaborating, thinking in very creative terms and innovative terms. And I think Catherine Novelli actually referred to some of this kind of work. Now, 90% of climate impacts are water related. So you absolutely cannot ignore the essential aspect of this. And I want to conclude by saying that while our help to other nations to deal with the water issues that they face is essentially humanitarian, it is also an aspect of US national security. And to demonstrate that, the intelligence community recently put out a report called Global Water Security. And I want to just quote one concluding paragraph from that report. Quote, in the next 10 years, many countries important to the United States will experience water problems that will risk instability and state failure, increase regional tensions, and distract them from working with the United States on important policy objectives. So that's why President Bush was correct and President Obama endorsed this, and every president since. I'm not sure whether President Trump did or not, but that's another matter. That was just a blip in our history. That's why there's a third D. That's why there is the 3D national security strategy. Now, the world population has grown by more than 5 billion people. Most people don't sort of want to take that in. Since about 1950, 5 billion more people on the face of this earth. The carrying capacity of the earth is being severely tested. And when people, you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when people cannot feed their family, when they cannot have access to potable water, they either die or they migrate. And that's what's happening. And we don't seem to have gotten our head around that issue. It's just human nature. So helping others to help themselves is called development, but that doesn't happen unless there is a relationship of trust. And that's why many USAID missions are absolutely dominated by Foreign Service national employees of the country, of that country. And you achieve that trust through diplomacy. That's why I call it development diplomacy.
Thank you, Brian. And I'd like to turn now to Aaron Salzberg, formerly at the Department of State and now head of UNC's Water Institute, to give his opening remarks.
How hard is this? Not only amazing individuals to have to follow, but I've probably worked for all of them at one point or another. And no matter how far you are removed from those experiences, you still don't want to embarrass yourself in front of former bosses. And so you want to do them justice. So this is really challenging. And maybe just a couple of things. First, just to clarify, for my 26 years in Washington, D.C., I live by the credo that it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't take credit. But now I'm in academia. And this is where attribution is everything. So let's set the record straight a couple of times here, right? The U.S. Global Water Strategy, I led that process. The National Intelligence Estimate that Brian just quoted from, it was Ron Schoonover and I who pitched that idea to Secretary Clinton and got her to initiate that. The Water for the World Act came out of a breakfast meeting that I had with Senator Bill Frist, which only happened because Bill Frist was lobbied by the faith-based community. And the faith-based community said, you got to talk to this Aaron Salzberg guy who's been lecturing on water to the faith-based folks about why it matters to them. Right, really, but so this, and I'm not saying this to impress, right? But I'm saying it to make the point that as diplomats, and this is something that I think Kathy was making and Ron was pointing to earlier, we recognize the power of scale and collective action, right? That we as individuals can really make a difference, and that in my case, as a scientist civil servant, you can affect change at scale, and you really can change the world. And to be frank, I think that's what drives us as diplomats. It drives us to do the things that we do, because trust me, these are not normal jobs that any normal human being would want. They are 24/7 devastating jobs to have to do. And in fact, one of the things I would tell my staff when I was in the Department of State is that it's not what you do as individuals, but it's about how many other people you can get to engage and take action on behalf of our shared goals and challenges, right? It's not what you do, but it's how many other people you can get to do what you want them to do. And it's about identifying the means and building the political will to drive others towards change. And each of us here have been really privileged to have had the opportunities as single individuals to be able to contribute to shaping that better world. And something I'm very fortunate to still be able to do here at the Water Institute UNC. And to be frank, I hope we can talk more about those issues. But okay, look, a lot's been said, but I want to try to bring together maybe a few loose ends. You all, I think, mentioned water in some way, shape, or form, but I really want to drive this home, right? I have to do this. Perhaps the most profound impacts of climate change will be on the hydrological cycle, right? Climate change will affect the distribution, the timing, the intensity of precipitation events across the globe. The water on which our food systems depend, our energy systems depend, and for many, our livelihoods and security depend, will all be at risk. But let's be clear as well, with or without climate change, we are heading towards a global water crisis. By 2030, more than 40% of the world's population will be living under water-stressed conditions, including more than 1 billion people who will not have enough water to be able to meet their domestic, economic, and environmental needs. Countries will become more fragile and will fail if they don't get the water equation right. And this, in some regards, makes water the ideal no-regret solution to climate change, right? Not only will you be investing in mitigation, but by building resiliency to floods and droughts, you're investing in adaptation, and you'll be improving human health, broad-based economic development, and peace and security, right? So it's a win all the way around. So whether you believe in human contributions to climate change or not, water is a no-regrets investment we can all agree on. No offense to the ocean folks. Second, and I have to say this as well too, as a scientist, right? Science and evidence data matter, but just don't believe it, right? Data is a double-edged sword. Much of the data that we collect is biased or subjective, often in ways we don't even think about or consider. And we're talking about very highly complex processes that often include a great deal of uncertainty. And this is why we often talk about how we use evidence to inform policymaking, and why the policymaking process is so important to properly contextualizing the data and the science within the right social, cultural, and political environment. In fact, the process of data collection is often more important than the data itself. And I hope we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, this is what leads me to my third and final point. Why does diplomacy matter? Why does it take diplomats to solve what most would consider to be purely technical types of problems. And the first reason is that, where you sit is where you stand, right? The decisions that people make are shaped by the social, cultural, political environment in which they exist. And if you ignore those factors, you risk arriving at suboptimal, unsustainable, or even harmful solutions, right? So these are important factors that need to be considered. And the second reason, it goes back to this process point, right? Process matters. And Kathy pointed this out. As a diplomat, or in my case, as a mediator, facilitator of conflicts over water, the most important outcome is not that the parties have arrived at their own solution and are left with the capacity to work together to solve their own problems. I just helped them on that way, right? Because look, at the end of the day, I'm going to go home. As Kathy said, their buying into the solutions is critically important for their adherence to those types of processes going forward. If you want to achieve meaningful, long-lasting results, countries have to own these solutions, but even more importantly, they have to have the skills to address what's coming next. And as diplomats, we can teach those skills. By working towards an agreement, you're demonstrating how to collect and analyze data, how to communicate across social, cultural, technical lines, how to err and resolve differences, how to make collective decision-making with imperfect information, right? Really hard things to do, but this is what diplomats do every single day. The one constant in the water world, and probably in the climate world too, is change, right? What you have today is not what you had yesterday and won't be what you have tomorrow. In water world, every solution is obsolete within a few short years. So having legal institutional arrangements that can adapt to these changing needs is absolutely critical, and having the skills to be able to adapt to rapidly changing conditions is essential. And that's the skill set that we as diplomats can bring. And these are the skills that diplomacy teach. For diplomats, the process isn't just the means to the ends, it is the ends. And that's really different. Diplomacy can create the enabling conditions that encourage respect, appreciation for different perspectives, for collaborative problem solving, all in the face of increasing complexity and uncertainty, both of which are growing at incredibly high rates, right? And water, in my case, right, I was not a water person when I came to the Department of State. But water was a tool where I could demonstrate democratic values, where I could build trust between parties that were in conflict, and where I could promote trust and peace and cooperation. It was a diplomatic tool to advancing our broader foreign policy interests, not just solving water problems, but our core diplomatic peace and security challenges as well. So this is why diplomacy matters, right? We create the environment for problem solving both today and in the future. And this is what people like Brian, Kathy, Ken, they're superheroes to me, right? These are people that I worshiped and was pleased to work for many, many years. So I'm just a real honor to be here.
Thank you. I think if we were going to do a mission statement for the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and our role in really preparing the next generation of leaders who can tackle these global challenges serially, we would probably start with what Aaron just said. It's a big part about what drives this diplomacy initiative. Now for the fun part, question and answers. The panelists all wanted maximum time to spend on question and answers. You know the drill. If you're here, get your question ready, raise your hand, and Ingrid will bring you a microphone. Maria from the American Academy of Diplomacy is watching the online feed for Q&A, the Q&A function. While you're getting your question ready, I'm going to take one that's been pre-submitted from Tricia Sullivan, professor in the Department of Public Policy and Peace, War, and Defense, and her PWAD 250 students. And here's the question. Should climate change be considered a threat to U.S. national security? And assuming the answer to that question is more or less yes, does the U.S. have the right balance of foreign policy tools to adequately address the threats posed by climate change and resource scarcity? Ken?
Let me have a start. Climate change is definitely a threat to U.S. national security for domestic reasons. I mean, I think Aaron alluded to the water washing away military infrastructure along all the coast, but also for international reasons. Again, its regions becoming destabilized. And if you look at our own southern border today, we've already got climate refugees coming from Guatemala, Central America, and other places. As we've heard from others tonight, people will move if they can't survive, and that movement's going to create problems, and it's going to be a security issue in those regions, and the security will redound on us as well. An unstable world is not a good world for the United States. My view is we do not have, I mean, we have the talent. I mean, you just heard Aaron and Brian talk about things that can be done, things that have been done, and Ambassador Novelli talking about some very important breakthroughs in other areas. So we have the talent on board. We don't have the political will. If we had the political will, we have the talent and the techniques and the contacts to really rock and roll on climate. But until we have a Congress in particular that will support real action on climate, that would allow us to push for legally binding agreements and then pass laws to make them real, we're working at the margins. And we really need to have a change of political will in this country. That's going to mean people need to be voted into office who think climate's a problem. It is a problem. There's no question about it.
Brian?
I think that it's encouraging to see some of the proposals that have been made by this particular administration, and the fact that a former Secretary of State has been given the role of negotiating on climate. As was mentioned by Kathy and others, the Paris Agreement, of course, is a voluntary agreement. It's called what we call soft law, which means that you've got to have a lot of data to embarrass people. I mean, it's name and shame. It's the main way that you can make sure that soft law has any impact at all. I'm a strong believer in institutions, because institutions, of course, in and of themselves, by definition, have processes, and they enable people to step forward. They give people a voice within that institution. I'm not sure that just having a presidential envoy, even a former Secretary of State with all of the authority of the president, is enough. And I agree exactly with what Ken said, that and what Cathy Novelli said as well, that the big issue here is whether or not there is an incentive to change. And climate change, unfortunately, is one of those things that's seen as being off into the future. Although if you've been through the rainstorm of today or yesterday, you might think it's immediate, and it is immediate. And I think, frankly, the president is trying to take advantage of the fact that Hurricane Ida hit. There is now more evidence to support the fact that climate change is affecting weather. There's a lot more evidence. There's a book written by someone that was in the Obama administration, a scientist who once worked for an oil company, who basically says the science isn't adequate yet in order to change public policy. I think that's baloney. There's adequate science to begin now to put in place the public policy that will have an impact on what is happening 10, 20 years from now. And increasingly, the science is becoming much more accurate, as the latest UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has demonstrated. This is a peer-reviewed panel. These are thousands of scientists around the world. I wouldn't be surprised if Aaron wasn't one of them. But the fact of the matter is that you've got to keep driving home that science and driving home the impact of climate change in order to change the political will. And the best way to do it, I think, is right. There has to be a price on carbon. That's the only way that I think the corporate world, and a lot of corporations are being very good about this. They're trying to see the future and take steps in advance. But they won't ever really change until that price factor is impacted.
I'll be quick and only add a couple of quick things, because Brian didn't say it, but we do have to increase our development assistance, right? I think we need to certainly make better use of, we do have the brains, we have the talent, we just need the political will. I completely agree with that. But we have the expertise to do the things. We need to create sustainable living environments outside the United States where people can meet their basic needs, water, food, energy, healthcare, education. If we cannot do that, they will turn to alternative sources, either for revenue generation, or they'll engage in activities that are not supportive of U.S. foreign policy interests. And so fundamentally, we have to work to do that everywhere. Conflict anywhere is not good for the United States, period. And so we do have to play a role in trying to create those environments. And I think I want to go back to a point Kathy made earlier, right? 4 years is an incredibly, maybe you'll say that, 4 years is an incredibly short period of time, particularly in government, particularly when you face bureaucratic inertia. And when you're getting in and trying to make change and make a difference, it can be incredibly to do that within our existing institutions without the right support, politically, financially, budgetarily, in every which way. And there is a huge resistance to change, right? And there's good reasons for that, right? It's part of our system of checks and balances, right? Yes, it slows down good things from happening, but it slows down bad things from happening too, right? So hopefully we move forward deliberatively and thoughtfully, and the solutions we make are the right ones for us, for the United States. But those are hard processes to manage and put in place. The stakeholders, I think Kathy, you mentioned it took, maybe it was Ron, that took 2 years for you to convince the US government to actually go ahead and take action on the, right? It literally took, right, 4 or 5 years for me to convince the US government to do something. That process, and of course, that's beyond the political timeframe of a lot of our political leaders. And so, and how do we, it's the career diplomats, the career development folks that we have that are working in these agencies for 20 years that can really help drive systemic change and reform, and we don't give them the tools that they need to succeed.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to live questions. And I'd like to see, could you please raise your hand? Here we are. And Ingrid will bring the mic. And if you're joining us virtually, please use the Q&A function and send it in.
Hi, I'm not sure how to ask this concisely, so I apologize if I ramble. And I also ask this in recognition that this is a diplomacy forum, and so we're focused on international relations. But it seems that Americans individually and the American government as a whole is very good at turning outward and recognizing the problems that exist in other countries, whether that's human rights or defense or other political issues. In the context of environmental issues, Americans, I believe, have the highest per capita emission rate. And among developed nations, we are embarrassingly far behind in environmental action. Do you think that America is doing enough inward reflection to mitigate those problems that we are largely contributing to?
Brian, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah. It is a very good question, a political question. And I think there are a lot of things now that people would say, okay, America's record is so bad, we really can't be leaders any longer in the world, whether it's on human rights or on climate or whatever. I don't think that's the way to look at it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in a real world, the United States still has tremendous amount of influence, no matter what happens here. What happened on January 6th, for example, challenges the notion that we should be promoting democracy anywhere. But I think our institutions held together. So, I mean, I think there are steps that are being taken, innovative steps in the corporate world, innovative steps in certain states in this country, wherein we've already made some impact on climate change, for example, that we can talk about internationally. So I think that it's tempting to say, okay, we're just going to go away and hide. And the fact of the matter is, I'm not going to say to you the United States is the indispensable nation. There are others. In fact, I would say this, I absolutely agree with Kathy. I just wrote an article a few weeks ago that we've got to stop the rhetoric on China. Yes, we should be concerned about human rights abuses in China. I mean, yes, we should be concerned by what they're doing to the Uyghurs and all of the other things that are happening in Hong Kong and the like. But we've got to have a dialogue with China on issues that we can talk to them about, and climate is one of them. And I take it that John Kerry's recent visit to China, the Chinese said, we're not going to help you on climate change if you don't stop bashing us. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is it's in China's interest to talk to us about climate change. And it's a matter of what the interests are of countries. If you're going to be a good diplomat, then you're going to be thinking about the other country's interest as much as you're thinking about your own interest. So I don't think that we should go and hang our head in shame, despite the fact that there are some shameful things that have happened in this country. We've just got to continue to be a world leader, no matter what.
Thank you, Brian. If America doesn't lead, it's pretty hard to get the conference together. Ken?
I'll just say one thing. America's a great convener. I mean, we do have a very spotty record. There's no question about that. But the Montreal Protocol that I referred to earlier, which is literally it's the best extant treaty in any area, not just the environment, because it's so effective. That came out of the US. And it came out of the US science identifying a problem, then it being worked within our system, companies were brought on board, and then we took it abroad and say, this is a global problem, we have to work on it. We had a lot of resistance from some of our major European partners, particularly, I won't name them. We got some major resistance, but over time that was worked down, and we have developed this this is a universal treaty. Everybody belongs to it. Everybody has obligations, and everybody gets help. It's a model of how to do things. And this is an example of US leadership. It's true that our politics in particular give us a very spotty record. We walked away from Paris, as Ambassador Novelli mentioned. We've done a variety of dumb things over the years, but on the whole, over time, we tend to trend in the right direction. And people still have faith in us, and we have to use that faith and use our skills and use our science in particular to bring issues to the fore, to find ways to deal with them, and then to try to build the consensus that we've heard about tonight, so the action actually happens, not in a voluntary way, ideally, but in a legally binding way. So I think we still need to act as if we can lead, because we can and we must.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, US expertise is just absolutely craved globally and internationally. They want to hear from us. And I think one of the most humbling experiences for me as a diplomat, the first time you walk into the UN to represent the United States and you put your placard up because you're going to speak. And I'm 5'7.5", unlike my colleagues. But when they call on the United States, the room goes dead silent. Everybody wants to hear what the United States is thinking and what they're saying. And so we do carry a great deal of weight internationally. And I think we still have, we have to take that leadership very, very seriously. And of course, the last 4 years has been very disappointing, I think, to some of us as diplomats who really helped to build that will. The other thing I'll do say, though, because your question was interesting, and I'm going to say one other thing. I do wonder whether the breakdown in discourse here in the United States, both politically, but even between us, has made it very difficult for us to solve very complex challenges. And so if you're getting at that, I very much worry. And I swear I'm relying on all of you to reset that, right? Because even if you have differing views, how we talk to each other about those differing views so that we can find a way to deal with infectious pandemics, climate change, a water crisis, I can go on. But if we can't find a way to have a discourse on those sets of issues and find a way of working together to deal with, we're in a lot of trouble. So if that was your point, I'm not sure I got a good answer for you.
I'm going to just jump in and use moderator's privilege to say I'm also counting on you for that political will that we all need. Ingrid, do you have a question from online? Maria?
We have a lot of questions from online. So I'm having a
We're here all
challenge
night. Ken
picking
really
one.
wants to
So
do
to
this.
give a few more students from online a voice, I'm gonna throw out two different ones. Sean O'Keefe asked, can you envision a potential conflict as a result of a failure to agree on climate change policy? If so, how far off are we from this type of scenario? And the second one, another student, Rio Aono, wanted to know your view on nuclear power as one of the more viable, efficient, and non or low carbon options. And specifically, what role would the United States play in the diplomatic field to increase the nuclear power usage and security to combat the high risk factors?
Great. Who wants to take nuclear power?
Yeah,
Okay, you take nuclear power.
I was the ambassador of the IEA, so I have a little bit of experience and I've done some things in the NGO world and the intelligence world as well. I do think that nuclear power has a role in dealing with climate change because it is the only emission-free wholesale source of power. There's a lot of innovation going on in the nuclear science, nuclear engineering areas. Most of that innovation, some of that innovation is being done in the United States. An awful lot of it's being done outside the United States. And virtually all the construction of new nuclear facilities is being done outside the United States. So the US role, the US voice internationally on these issues, particularly with regard to security and making strong climate links, is weakened by the fact that we're not doing more at home. We're not taking advantage of the expertise we have. 20% of our power still comes from nuclear energy. That's going to start to be reduced over the next 3 or 4 years. So I do think there is a role, and I think it's important that we don't want to see the Chinese and the Russians dominating the nuclear industry. That's going to have a variety of implications for us.
Thank you. Aaron?
So I'll try the conflict one a little bit. And I want to be careful here because conflict is a really complicated thing, right? And to attribute a climate as the proximal cause of a conflict is really kind of difficult in many respects. And we can't do that with water either. But look, we have seen a couple of examples that give us pause, right? In Syria, for example, we saw a major drought in the northern part of the country that led to mass migrations down into Damascus. What was interesting, though, of course, it was the way the Assad government responded to that crisis that probably incited a lot of the unrest and contributed to the unrest that led to a civil war that was going on in the country, right? We saw huge climate events going on in 2010 when we had shifts in the Hadley cells, where the Russian wheat crop was the Russian wheat crop was wiped out by a huge drought. The Pakistani wheat crop was wiped out by massive monsoons. And of course, those were two major exporters to the Middle East. We saw bread prices rise in the Middle East. Again, not necessarily a proximal cause, but certainly a contributing factor in raising prices of food products and a contributing factor to unrest we saw across the Middle East. We have certainly seen countries threaten each other over the building of a dam, a piece of infrastructure that could impact the flow of water from one country into another. Again, really complicated issues to say that this is due to water or due to climate change, but I think there's no question that as we go forward, that increased resource scarcity is going to drive and contribute to a lot of these types of problems, both nationally and within countries, but also between countries.
Thank you. I think we may be out of time to keep taking questions. And so I wanted to invite Ambassador Newman to come up to the podium to give concluding remarks. And while he's making his way up, I also want to note that some of you who are with us tonight and online will have a chance tomorrow. So that's the Transatlantic Master students, the Masters in Public Health, the Euro majors, PWAT 250. You're going to have a chance to talk further tomorrow with Ambassador Brill, who graciously volunteered to stay on so he could spend time with you. For my part, I'd like to thank everyone, Kathy, our 3 panelists, Ron, everyone, Ingrid Smith, who has just done a brilliant job making this come together, for your thought in, for your role in making this event so enlightening and thought-provoking. Ron?
Well, I just have the honor of closing out. I am really sorry that we could not get to more questions. You could see, and I think we saw it online as well, that the subject is fascinating, and the expertise that has been here tonight gives you I think a whole different dimension of understanding different ways to think about these problems. That's just to think about solutions, to think about how one acts on them. So I want to thank, first of all, Barbara and UNC Global for being our host tonight. Couldn't be here without you. Look forward to continued cooperation with the Academy. I want to thank every one of our speakers. Kathy, great to be with you again. Ken, Brian, Eric, thank you so much. I want to add my special thanks to Ingrid, but also to Maria Rosas of my staff, who takes an enormous amount of organizational work off my shoulders so that I get to stand up here and make speeches, and she gets to keep the work going. And given the number of questions we couldn't get to, I think we'll have to think together and with Barbara about what it is we can do more of to just to deal with some more questions.
And so that gives us our homework as well. And on that note, I thank you all for coming and for being part of this. Thank you very much.